we really spent probably the last 6 months or so since I last talked to you, mostly
Mhm.
just focused on stability, focused on security, and just kind of maturing up the fundamentals of that chain before we wanted to move on and added like new major features like Thor-Fi, synthetics, adding more chains, like all this stuff. We wanted to kind of put that on pause. Let's put that off until we kind of figure out that the base layer is more secure, more reliable, more resilient, all these things.
I live unbanked off of cryptocurrency, and I use Bitrefill extensively because it lets me pay with crypto at places that don't yet accept it directly. This one service, more than any other, helps me live on crypto, pay your prepaid phone bill, or buy gift cards to thousands of major retailers around the world, all with cryptocurrency, including for exact amounts so you don't have to buy more gift credit than you need for a specific purchase. You can use Bitrefill without an account, but if you get an account, you can earn rewards points, which translate to savings, and you can also hold a balance denominated in dollars or euros to protect yourself against market crashes. Go to bitrefill.com, click Create Account, and enter the referral code DCN, or follow the link in the description. So, hey everyone, I have once again the wonderful honor of speaking with the one and only Chad Barraford, newly, I guess, core dev of THORChain. How's it going, man?
How's it going? Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back as well. It's crazy to think just how much has transpired in the last 6, 8, 9 months. I don't remember how long it's been since the last time we talked, but new year, new me. Might as well dive into stuff a little bit more. I
Yeah.
feel like THORChain was much less on people's radar way back when, and now it's kind of a bigger thing, and still I think very under the radar, which is very bizarre to me.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny. I don't have a good sense of like how on the radar or off the radar the project is, to be honest with you, because my head's just
Hmm.
down in code all the day, and so I really don't keep put my head up much. But
Hmm.
like I always kind of thought it was more on the radar because we were doing something that nobody's ever done before. We're basically creating new technology that or innovation that's never existed before, and it completely changes the state of crypto in general. So I just assumed that this would kind of catch on fire in some sense to some degree, just because of that value proposition.
Hmm.
But like when I did a couple of conferences not too long ago, and I was just kind of chatting with other speakers and whatever, and I was kind of surprised how like little people even knew what THORChain was, like even
Hmm.
heard of it. And I was just like, oh, this is kind of interesting. This is kind of surprising to me. But you're right. It's quite actually under the radar. And even now, I still think it's under the radar. Like, I don't think it's really quite, people quite recognize what it is or what it does. And even if they do, they have a very simplistic perspective of it, or like an overly simplified version of it. Like somebody who says that Bitcoin is a digital money. And it's like, well, yeah, that's true. But like,
There's a lot
there's something
more.
much more significant happening here if you kind of look between the lines and dive a bit deeper. And so I get the kind of feeling sense that THORChain's kind of that same sense in the earlier days of Bitcoin in some sense.
Yeah, and that might be a good almost backwards way of starting things. Who else is doing this as far as you know? Who's doing I would say it doesn't have to be 100% the exact same thing, but just native cross-chain decentralized exchange and liquidity protocol. I remember seeing some mention that someone is forking THORChain to make a competing complementary whatever, but other than that I haven't heard anything. Is anyone else trying to do the same thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, whenever you have a successful network, you will likely have forks and
Mhm.
competitors, and like it's just a natural thing to occur. I mean, Ohm's a good example of that. Like Ohm had to launch their thing, and there's been like I don't know how many forks, right? And that's largely
Mhm.
because Ohm is an interesting design. It's a novel concept,
Mhm.
and people get excited about it. And THORChain is a bit similar in that sense, in that it's a novel concept, a novel idea that offers some real value. And so, yeah, there are a bunch of people out in the space who are doing cross-chain indexes or cross-chain swaps in different ways, and they have different value in the way they approach it. Some are, well, oftentimes these, if you want to call them competitors, they have half solutions to the problem of cross-chain. Like they only will
Mhm.
ever work with, chains, A, B, and C, but never work with chains D, E, and F, right? And so that then becomes like kind of a half solution to the problem. Some of them kind of completely ignore economic risks to the design, which is a bit funny for me.
Hmm.
Some actually, use a design different from THORChains, like largely based on THORChains, but they make some small modifications to it that end up harming the economic design quite significantly. And even some they sound like they're competitors, but they're not. Like Layer 0 and IPC are both cross-chain communication standards rather than actual bridges per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're not quite competitors in any sense of that, at least from my viewpoint. And then we have like these forks. I've seen probably maybe like 2 or 3 forks of somebody who's forked the code into their separate repo. And I think there's one that's just started called Maya Protocol that's starting up or starting to be worked on at least. And we've, as a team, the core devs have kind of given some advice, on tips and their design and implementation, and we'll see how it goes. But all those things, I mean, forks are actually a good thing, right? We always have said from the beginning that THORChain should not be the only thing in existence in terms of, moving liquidity from one asset or one chain to another. They want to have a healthy ecosystem within crypto. We need 4 or 5 or so different systems that can all kind of operate. So THORChain is kind of the biggest guy in the room, right? And it's kind of the first mover in many respects, and in my opinion, by far the strongest design and implementation. But I'm sure we're going to see other forks and competing concepts, and I encourage them to come along and to provide more value and more service to the greater crypto sphere.
Yeah, and that's one reason why I would call myself like a DeFi dinosaur a little bit, because I've been in this space for like 8 years, but I didn't get DeFi until relatively soon. In fact, I didn't really get it fully until I found out about THORChain, because all the other stuff just didn't make sense to me. It's like, okay, so I have a bunch of different assets. Why would I get Ethereum specifically, pay a bunch of fees, of course, that's a different subject, but then get some little token that still requires Ethereum to move around, and then put it on a thing where I swap it for a thing, and then get a wrapped asset of this thing on something else. And it just didn't, like, people were talking about DeFi as revolutionary. I just thought it was like some weird, dumb, gambly thing. But it wasn't until like with THORChain, you could kind of do some of that stuff without the wrapping. And just like I should give a sort of a user experience flow example of doing DeFi on like on a non completely native cross chain deck. So I was using, I don't know if you're aware of Incognito, but it was another. I hope it's still going to be working for a while because it's still pretty interesting. But the user experience process of using that for me is you deposit a coin, you wait until you get this little wrapped asset that then you need some sort of the actual native token to provide as gas, even though it's a dust amount or whatever. And then you swap it for another wrapped version of that, and then maybe you can withdraw on the other end. And whenever I've swapped something with THORChain, I hit swap, and I get the new thing. And that's just it. And just all that crap in between. No, not talking down, because there's a lot of interesting and like utility and other use cases behind the in-between stuff. But all that stuff in between is, I think, probably why people don't really get DeFi in general. I don't know if you'd kind of agree with that.
Yeah. So like DeFi has tremendous potential behind it, but it also has whenever you have something that's innovative, you also you have like the innovators who are just idealistic and see what the value can be, and then you always have people who are like there for the opportunity, right? Like for the ability to see the number go up. Do you know what I mean by that? Like, there are a lot of people who just like buy and sell Bitcoin all day and trade and whatever, like, between stable coins and Bitcoin, trying to play the market. And that's what they're interested in. They're just interested in, increasing their net worth effectively. And they completely miss like the amazing revolution that Bitcoin fundamentally is. And they just completely ignore that component. That's like the thing of actual value, at least in my view.
Of course.
Like the actual revolution in like in human rights as I see it, and self-sovereignty and freedom that's granted to all peoples across the entire planet, no matter where you live. And that's just like monumental by itself. And so DeFi is a little bit similar in the sense that it has great potential to actually give a huge movement in terms of human rights, allowing everybody to have access to financial services across the entire planet, no matter where you live, is like revolutionary. That can change everything. But you also have these people who just see this opportunity to be like, to be degens, right? And just, or like degenerative gamblers in a sense, and be able to like, oh, I'm going to like move the thing to here and then get the like yield on that. And then I'm going to take that like asset that I get from this and I'm going to move it over here. And they start like compounding their interest across like 5 different smart contracts to create this massive yield system that's like completely built on fragility and like, you know, and liquidations and like all these risks. And so then some people do that, and that's your bag, and that's your bag, and there's nothing wrong with that. But DeFi is so much more than that, as I like to think about it as, right? And I think what THORChain's doing, to your point, what you were saying, to give your example, is that in the earlier days of DeFi, the only place you could really do it was Ethereum. And with that came limitations of what was possible. And then you had to do all these wrapped assets things, and the security of those wrapped assets are always highly questionable, whether, you know, it's a centralized bridge or decentralized bridge, or how decentralized that bridge is. And as long as you hold that wrapped asset, you're always exposed to the risk of the bridge underneath it. There's all these issues and problems. And so THORChain, in many respects, came along and was really, in my opinion, the first DeFi protocol that was just like, you know what, we're going to allow DeFi to exist on any and all chains, and have everybody have it be a first-class citizen, whether you're Bitcoin or a Doge or Ethereum person, you know, a Cardano fan, like whatever camp you kind of tend to sit in. Everybody's a first-class citizen, and everybody has access to the same financial services, no matter where you're coming from. And that's how it really should be. Like the idea that I'm only going to provide services for like these people or these assets is kind of like a self-defeating concept. It's like, it's a nonsensical like limitation you're putting on yourself. It's like saying, I'm going to build a company and I'm only going to sell it to the Japanese. Like, I'm not going to sell my product to the Australians or to the Italians or whatever. It's just a bit silly and from a fundamental perspective. And so THORChain's just like, we don't care who you are. We don't care what asset you're talking about. We're just going to provide the same exact services no matter where you are. And by doing so, like we're about to add Dogecoin in the very near future. And by doing so, we're adding DeFi to Doge, which is, in my opinion, like the biggest news event in Doge history ever since Doge was like created, you know, way back.
Yeah, legitimately the biggest news event, maybe in terms of popularity, the second biggest after Elon noticed it, but that's a different spectrum.
Elon's a planet himself, and a lot of things revolve around him in a sense. But like from a fundamental, like the fact that Elon backs Doge from a fundamentalist perspective doesn't really matter. Like it doesn't, like it just creates a perception of value, right? But THORChain is doing something that actually is changing the fundamentally of Doge, because now only are you capable of trading in and out of Doge without going through a centralized party and going completely and staying decentralized and be able to move out in and as free and as often as you choose. But you can also now earn Doge on your Doge, like layer one Doge, earn layer one Doge on your layer one Doge. Like that is a fundamental change in the actual ecosystem of the Doge like community. Right. That's a massive thing. And I hope the Doge community kind of like realizes. Right.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I've noticed. It inherently enhances the, I guess, productivity of all the chains it supports, because in the past, like I remember when, you had like the masternode coin boom, where everyone was like, well, you can just have your coin sit there, but if you get one of these coins and you run a special node and stuff like that, you get like interest on your money, basically, like without trusting a centralized company or anything. But that was limited to certain assets. But now it's like everything can kind of do that now. Just like, in the past, the altcoin boom, I guess, of 2017 or before, whenever, was more characterized by special feature coins. And in the future, or dare I say the present, it's more like it's available to everyone. And that's also a limitation that I think that people don't necessarily appreciate of all these different DeFi protocols on different chains where, okay, like you got Ethereum and then you got Pulse Chain. People are saying, oh, Pulse Chain is going to like do everything the Ethereum does, but like better, but then have all the same assets on it or something like that. And then you have like Binance Smart Chain doing their stuff. And then you have, Smart BCH built on Bitcoin Cash. You have all these kinds of things, but it just now all the assets are just their new set of assets on their new chain. And it's just annoying as anything to swap in between, right? To get like
Yeah.
Tether.
Yeah.
Oh, Tether's on this thing. Okay, well, but does the Tether on Ethereum match with the Tether on Tron, for example? Like, does it match?
Yeah.
Not really. Kind of, but not really. And the limitation of that just isn't really the same if you have something that's actually cross-chain.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. You have to remember that every one of these layer ones that pop up, like Binance Smart Chain, for example, you have to have what's the medium of transfer from one side to the other side. Now, between EVM to EVM, that's a relatively easy problem to solve. It's been around for quite a while because it abstract. You don't have to solve a deeper issue. It's just easier to build, and we've seen a bunch of these bridges already exist because that's the low hanging fruit to solve. But like even something like Binance Smart Chain, its value proposition is, hey, we're Ethereum, but it's more centralized and it has lower gas fees. That's its value proposition. There's nothing fundamental about that, right? It doesn't
Yeah.
do anything more than what Ethereum already does. It just says we're just a cheaper version. And now the sphere has said that that's valuable because a lot of shrimps can't use Ethereum because it's like $300 to do it, transactions sometimes, right? Like
I can't use Ethereum. I
kind
have
of
so much random
yeah.
Ethan tokens locked up that if I touch them, they just explode in value.
They would just
get
lose a lot of
destroyed.
their value to some degree, right? In some sense. But we have to get away from the idea. In 2017 was full lesson. We still see some projects today that are so focused on like glory stats, right? Like, oh, we can do 10,000 transactions per second. Like it's as if like that is meaningful. Like to my opinion, it's not. Like Bitcoin Cash said that, oh, we can do more transactions per second than Bitcoin. Therefore, we're better than Bitcoin. Therefore, we are more valuable than Bitcoin. No, that's not quite how it actually works. It's not that, it's glory stats don't get you as far as you think it does. And so what you really want to look for in layer ones, in my opinion, is what are they doing that is actually a value proposition. And if their value proposition is like, we can do what you can already do just a little bit faster, I'm a little bit skeptical about what the value proposition actually is there,
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, while we're talking about all this cool stuff that is enabled by THORChain, and obviously the fact that it kind of stands almost alone in that no one else is really doing anything similar, that of course includes a lot of growing pains and bumps along the road in the well-dubbed chaosnet. And so last year there was a certain amount of chaos on the chaosnet. Would you mind giving just like a brief rundown of sort of some of the mayhem that happened last year?
Yeah, sure. So the short of it is that the network was exploited a couple times. In total, it took, I think the black hats or white hats, however you want to define them, took, I think it was like around $15 million or so. All of it from Ethereum-based exploits and how Ethereum is Solidity is a very, relatively speaking, very easy thing to manipulate with smart contracting. So people found some issues and they used those issues to extract funds. Now the network was in, as you said, chaosnet, so it's limited the on purpose how much TVL could be in the network. So the amount of funds available to steal was relatively small, right? Like we've seen, other projects like Compound and Poly and Badger and all these things like are well over $100 million in assets, taken. So that was like the rough of it. And so once that happened, the community kind of said, let's slow down. Let's kind of take a step back. Let's kind of reevaluate things to make sure we're all on a good path here, right? And so the network was paused by the community. They chose to do so. And then we did multiple audits. I mean, I lost track of how many. And it was 2 externals. I don't know how many internals. A bunch of researchers did some unofficial ones as well. There's a complete change in terms of like the security. We added an entire new team on the THORChain project called THORSec that is 100% dedicated to reviewing every PR, every code change, and basically trying to attack it 24/7, more or less. We had a new security functionality, like new blanketed protections on the network. So even if somebody were to find an exploit now, it would be hard to extrapolate funds. All that kind of stuff, like a whole series of things happen. So we really spent probably the last 6 months or so since I last talked to you, mostly just focused on stability, focused on security, and just kind of maturing up the fundamentals of that chain before we wanted to move on and added like new major features like THOR-Fi, synthetics, adding more chains, like all this stuff. We wanted to kind of put that on pause. Let's put that off until we kind of figure out that the base layer is more secure, more reliable, more resilient, all these things. So that's basically what we've been doing for a long period of time. And we've hired in a whole series of individuals, external teams, internal teams, all sorts of things just to ensure that that is as buttoned up and as tight as humanly possible.
Yeah. And so, first off, how were the results of that? Are they to your satisfaction? And the next thing is these sort of exploit. I mean, again, just going from the smack talk you hear around, is this just a natural thing that has to happen as a new protocol grows, or were there maybe some corners cut in how quickly things were pushed to release?
Okay, so the first part of your question was,
Yes.
am I as satisfied?
Are you satisfied today, or as satisfied
Yeah.
as one could reasonably be in such a rapidly evolving landscape?
Yes. So when we approached this problem months ago, we made a list of every reasonable thing we can think of to implement or to change, or to whether that be code, whether that be policy, whether that be something else. Like we just made a whole series of things. We made an official bug bounty program. We had a bug bounty program before, but we just didn't make it like official program.
Yeah.
And so we did a whole series of things, everything we could reasonably think of, and we implemented every single one of those things. And it took a very long period of time to do that. It's a lot of coaching. There's a lot of pulling in a bunch of teams. I supported some of these audit teams to make sure they have all their answers, the questions answered, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, before we actually start things up again, we want to make sure we felt good about the state of things, right? Now, that being said, it doesn't matter how many audits you do. It doesn't matter what changes you make. It doesn't matter what you do. You will never know if there are more exploits or not. Right, like there's no way you could ever realize, because it's a known unknown. You know that you don't know it, right? And so we could have exploits 10 years from now, right? Or any chain for that matter. It doesn't matter. Like any project can have like Comp, right, had an exploit. It was like 5-6 years after it was launched, where it had $130 million of Comp tokens, right? And that's not. I'm not saying that as like a dig at Comp. Comp's a great project with a smart team behind it, right? Like I'm not saying that at all. It's just the natural thing of software, right?
Of course.
So in the beginning, it always starts off when it's like the most immature, right? And then and not as hardened. And as time goes on, you find bugs and you find issues, you fix them, and you patch them as you go along. Now, for a good software, for a good code base, what you will naturally find is that the further down the line you go, the timeline, you will find that the bugs that you're finding are increasingly less significant in terms of like their impact. They're going to become more rare, and the scenario of which they are triggered will become increasingly more edge case or more kind of weird situations, right? And that's exactly what we've been observing in THORChain's case in general. So we are definitely in a very stronger point at this point from a security perspective. Absolutely. Is the chain more reliable? Absolutely. That is like a hands down. There's no hesitation on that. But I will never say, you will never catch me saying that we are bug free, we are exploit free. There'll never be a case where that happens. Even Bitcoin had an infinite mint bug like 10 years after it was like launched, right?
Yeah.
And that has 800 contributors, over a long period of time, right? You will never be in that state. Bitcoin will never be in that state. No asset, no chain, no nothing will ever be like that. So we have to think about it in those terms, not think about it as like, okay, now it's secure. We did an audit, so it's fine now. Like you can't have that mentality. It's a very wrong mentality.
That being said, you can't have a mentality where it's like, all right, this is reasonably secure enough that you're willing to consider it to be like as a mainnet ready, which sort of brings me to mainnet. So mainnet in most, I guess, crypto projects means you're dealing with real money, which chaosnet his while not mainnet has kind of been a mainnet under those conditions.
Right.
Now, real mainnet, first off, how far are we away from that, and what all does it include that's above and beyond the current chaosnet stat?
Yeah, so you're right. So most projects will just like launch mainnet immediately with real funds, and then like throw caution into the wind, and like whatever happens, happens. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
we've seen projects that like launch, and then like day two, there's some exploit where like all the money's lost, like 1.4. I remember one
Mm-hmm.
was like $1.4 billion or something like
It's
insane.
a
Like,
little
you know what I mean? I
hilarious.
remember projects like hundreds of millions of
Mm-hmm.
dollars. Like, oops, there we go. Like, so THORChain had a much more guarded launch in the way that it thought it thinks about things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's partially because the project is far more difficult and ambitious and complex than almost every other DeFi protocol in crypto. It's like it's much more difficult task. That's why nobody's
Mm-hmm.
done it before. Like that's why we're
Yeah, of
like blazing
course.
the trail here, because like I remember I was talked to somebody over at a very well known
Mm-hmm.
DeFi protocol, and I asked that person, like, why didn't you include Bitcoin in this cross chain thing that you're going to be building? And he said, because it's too hard.
Bitcoin, not
Yeah, he's like,
Ethereum,
no,
but Bitcoin.
Bitcoin's too hard to integrate. It's blah blah blah. Which he's right. It is very difficult. It's very hard,
Mm-hmm.
right? And but like we have to think about what our vision is here. It's not like, do you want to make the next evolutionary step in DeFi, or do you want to make the next revolutionary step in DeFi? And if you're excluding Bitcoin from your mentality, then you're basically like taking the easy road, the low
Mm-hmm.
hanging fruit road, and not thinking about what the actual community of crypto actually needs, which is support for any chain, including the biggest and most important chain in crypto, which is obviously Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So where are we as far as like how far are we to mainnet, and what new stuff does it have?
Yes. Okay. So mainnet is approximately maybe like a month away, if you ask me.
Mm-hmm.
It requires the community to get involved to be okay with this and to be a part of the process. It's not my decision personally, but in my view, I think it'll be probably here within the next month. What is needed before we get to that point? Um, we wanted to add a few more chains, so we'll probably see Doge added, Terra added, and possibly Atom
Mm-hmm.
or the Gaia chain. We want to remove the caps on the system,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can add liquidity all day long if you really wanted to. And then we also wanted to make sure that the reserve has the full amount of funds. Right now, it's like, I think it's half of the amount that it should have, right? And so over time, we wanted to increase that until we get to that mainnet status. I think those are the three things that I think off the top of my head. I might be missing one or two, but those are the ones I can remember right now.
Yeah. So basically, the reserve, you want to completely eliminate the caps, and then you want to have add a couple extra chains to the mix. Regarding,
Yeah, just to
yeah.
prove that we can add chains to a live system, right? A live network.
Mm-hmm.
So to show that it's ready to go ahead and start, open the floodgates in a matter of speaking, and start just adding chains, I don't know, left
Yeah.
and right.
And so then after that, as far as adding new chains, it is much more of a floodgate situation, right? Where you might possibly have like a dozen new ones at a time or something like that.
Well, we probably wouldn't do a dozen at a time. We probably like each churn, which happens every 3 days, we might add one chain. That's probably the
Yeah.
fastest you could theoretically go. You probably wouldn't want to go any faster than that, but that's really fast. Like that's a crazy fast pace right there. We're probably more likely to see like one every 2 weeks or one every month or so, because it takes time to build that chain client and validate it and deploy it to StageNet, get Xchain JS, which is a JavaScript library to support it as well, get it into the smoke test, get it into like there's a lot of work around every chain. And so it's
Mm-hmm.
not like something you can just bust out in an hour. And so we'll probably see it once every 2 weeks, maybe once every month or so. We'll get a new chain added. But like the funny thing is that we only have 5 chains that are supported today, which is Bitcoin, Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash, Litecoin, and BNB.
Mm-hmm.
And of those 5 chains, that's like 90 something percent of the total liquidity of crypto. Like you're already supporting, the vast majority of
Yeah.
the crypto sphere. And so every chain that you add is going to have, a diminishing returns effect to it. And so like, we're going to go from 92 to 93 and then, or whatever the numbers are, right? And then at some point after you get to like maybe 15 chains or 20 chains, whatever the number is, like every chain you add after that point is going to offer very little value to the actual network itself, right? So we're not going to be adding like every chain underneath the sun. We're probably only going to add like maybe 15 or 20 chains, to be honest with you, the ones that actually have economic value, you know, decent trade volume that actually would provide value to the network as a whole. And that will probably won't be, you know, more than 15 or 20, in my opinion. But it's not up to me to decide these things. Again, it's up to the community to decide how many chains we want to add and which chains these things will be. I mean, I have no idea personally. I'm just kind of going up what the community tells us what they want to add.
Yeah, interesting. So, and what is the community mechanism for this? And that's always it's always one of those like the ultimate questions in decentralized governance is what constitutes a community, what constitutes community input and stuff like that. So is it just you see demand from people? Is it node operators, like a percentage of node operators start talking about this? Is it you see different parts of like crypto communities stepping forward and building their own integration, getting liquidity and stuff like that? And then after that, who makes the ultimate decision on these kinds of things?
Yeah, in the end, it's going to be the node operators. They're the ones that actually run the software, right, of the network and get to choose what changes are made or not made. And they all go through their own, as a voting process, they basically go through to adopt changes or to not adopt changes. And so they are the ones that decide what chains get added and potentially removed in some cases and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so we also have a lot of I've heard the term synths thrown around, and I've heard the term Thor-Fi thrown around. And so do you want to just talk about what those things are, and then also a possible realistic timeline for deployment?
Yeah, sure. So synthetics is the idea that because THORChain has these pools, these liquidity pools for every asset in the network, be Bitcoin, Ethereum, or Tether, or Doge, or whatever, it always knows the value of or the price of any of those particular assets at any given time. And so that for that reason, it's capable of minting an asset that is backed by the pool itself. So if you mint a synthetic Bitcoin, for example, on the THORChain network, it's backed by the pool of Bitcoin, which is comprised of, you know, Bitcoin and Rune. So it's basically collateralized by 50% Bitcoin and 50% Rune. And so once you have this kind of local asset, native asset to THORChain that represents the purchasing power of a Bitcoin or an Ether, you can then use that asset for all sorts of different things, right? And that's going to be like the gateway into what we call THOR-Fi, for example. So one of the concepts of THOR-Fi is what we call Thor savings, which is kind of like an interest account, right? Where you can have single asset exposure to a fixed rate income of whatever asset if you choose. So you can go ahead and take some Bitcoin, send it into the network, and then earn, you know, fixed rate 5%, 10%, 20%, depending on what the network's economics push are. And you can earn Bitcoin on your Bitcoin without taking on the economic or the coin movements of Rune, right? You're only ever exposed to the price movements of Bitcoin, and then you're earning more Bitcoin on your Bitcoin. That's a pretty cool thing, a very significant thing. You're always increasing the quantity of Bitcoin that you have rather than decreasing. And even like there's no impermanent loss, for example, that you can be experiencing.
And how is that handled? How do you manage to take away the fluctuation risk of Rune, even if it's based on the, like, for example, let's say you do a Bitcoin, it would be based on the Bitcoin pool, which is half Bitcoin and half Rune, right? And so if it is, then how if the pool fluctuates on the one side, how do you stop the actual synth from fluctuating?
Yeah. So basically, what happens is the collateral, like all the synths together of the Bitcoin pool, is worth X amount, some amount, whatever that dollar figure is, right? And the network kind of carves out of the ownership of that pool, whatever amount of units of ownership of that pool to be equal to the value of all those synthetic Bitcoins that exist on the network. So as Bitcoin price goes up or down, or Rune's price goes up and down, the number of units of ownership of that pool increase or decrease depending upon whatever direction needs to happen in order for it. So the LPs of that pool take on that risk, and it basically puts them into a leveraged position, so to speak, right? So if the price of Bitcoin goes up relative to Rune, right, they have a leveraged position in a downward angle, right? And the price of Rune goes up relative to Bitcoin, they have a leveraged position on the upward angle, right? So it's like they're taking on, they're LPing into a pool with a little bit of leverage thrown on top of it. So they'll earn more income or they'll lose more depending upon how that pool operates. Now, even if they lose more and they get into the red or whatever, that doesn't actually matter because the network has impermanent loss protection. So if you do experience a situation where you're at a loss from where you started, after 100 days, the network will say, you know what, we'll go ahead and front you and we'll give you some extra value so that when you pull out your Bitcoin, you will, won't take that loss. The network will take the loss for you. And the reason why the network can do that is because we've done the math and the slip-based model, along with other things, make it so profitable to provide liquidity into THORChain that the number of people, the number of capital that has impermanent loss after 100 days is like, it's very, very small. And so it doesn't really matter in the context of the network at all. So, so even that leverage, you take on that leverage position, even if you get leveraged down, the network still takes on that risk for you. But if you get leveraged up, then you take all of that back with take it all back home.
So from the technical standpoint, someone deposits Bitcoin into a pool, then the pool mints a token or whatever, tokenized representation that is in this person's possession, then that compounds with interest or whatever according to the agreement of whatever they did. And then when they withdraw it, then that synth is, I guess, destroyed or burned or whatever, and then Bitcoin comes out of the pool in the amount of whatever the person's principal plus their interest would happen. Is that kind of the way it happens?
That's basically it in a nutshell.
And how is that able to be really smooth in the user experience standpoint to where someone doesn't even see all that's happening? They just put in Bitcoin, they see their money go up, and then they just take more Bitcoin out.
Yeah. It's only a single action to do one or a single action to do the other, right? So you send Bitcoin in and then you ask for it back. And everything else is just abstracted away for you. It all happens, all that complicated stuff about synthetics and blah, 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 and units and these things. That's all done autonomously in the back end. You don't have to, it's like driving a car. You don't need to know how a car engine works. You just need to know how to use the steering wheel, right? More or less, right? It's conceptually the same. All you need to know is how to send in funds and ask for them back. That's the steering wheel part of it. All the complexity, the math, blah, blah, blah. All that stuff is done on the back end. That's the engine of that car, so to speak. And you don't need to have an understanding of how that functions. You can if you want. You want to read about it. There's documentation. You can read all about it. But all you need to know is how to send in funds and how to ask for them back.
Yeah. And so from the standpoint of a liquidity provider, if you are providing liquidity so comparing let's just say a Bitcoin liquidity provider with a Bitcoin synth owner, I guess, the liquidity provider takes on the risk but potential reward of the fluctuations of the price of Rune in 50% as well as Bitcoin. And I'd assume that because it's riskier because of that I would get a higher rate providing liquidity than I would, obviously not all time, but I would tend to get a higher returns providing liquidity than just getting a synth. Is that kind of the way it would work?
Yeah. So when somebody mints a synth by contributing value into the pool, like the Bitcoin pool, for example, that you're contributing value to the pool, but you're not getting any interest from that, right? Any swaps that happen and interest that's made in the pool don't go to you. You're a synth holder. You're not an LP. You're a synth holder. And so any value that you would have gotten by contributing that value to the pool, you're basically saying, I don't want that. I'm going to give it to the LPs, right? And so that's why it's like a leveraged position, because I'm contributing to the total value of the pool, but I'm not asking for any returns. I'm just asking
Mm-hmm.
for stability, right? In a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why you, as an LP, you like synthetics, because people are contributing value to the pool, and that any swaps that they would have been getting, they're not getting. You're getting it instead.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so basically, you've just negotiated a flat rate rather than an actual share in the earnings of the pool.
Yes. Yeah, you're dismissing your earnings of the pool for the interest of maintaining the value of the assets you put into it effectively.
Yeah, and so particularly for something like, let's just say, a stable coin, if someone put in a BUSD or something like that and did some BUSD synths, then that operates out more or less exactly like a USD savings account in terms of, although I'm sure very much higher returns than the terrible ones you get at a bank, and
It's
but
more
still,
than a 0.5%.
yeah,
I can probably tell you that.
yes, but it's just still stable. You don't have ups and downs of price. Just it's still pegged to the, I would say, downward stability of the US dollar, but that's a different subject. You're
Yeah.
pegged to that, and then you're getting interest on top of that, and at a very predictable rate.
Yeah. Yeah. The goal of the store savings specifically is to give fixed rate income, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because nobody in this space really does fixed rate for a whole host of reasons, which we can dive into if you want to.
Mm-hmm.
But fixed rate
Well,
is like, in my respect, it's my viewpoint. It's one of the most kind of unachieved, important aspects of finance that we haven't seen yet much in crypto yet. And fixed rate, it allows people to have predictable yield, a predictable income,
mm-hmm.
which just changes the economics, changes the way that you value something quite significantly.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that this is contributing to not just my asset, right, or or
Mm-hmm.
whatever, it's contributing to any asset, like BYOA, bring your own asset.
Mm-hmm.
That's even bigger.
Yeah, so uh, why isn't this really implemented widely in the crypto community?
In terms of
Sort of
fixed
fixed rate,
rates,
yeah.
well, fixed rates often used as a mechanism to be able to put kind of guardrails on the
Mm-hmm.
economics of a system. So, in something like in Aave, for example, or Comp, whatever, their interest rate is relative to the amount of the asset that they have in the system. So someone might deposit a bunch of ETH, for example, and then they start loaning out that ETH to people. And as the quantity of ETH in the system gets lower or higher, that will change the economics to either call back more ETH because the interest rates become so high, or people won't take out new loans or whatever, or vice versa,
Mm-hmm.
right? In THORChain's case, we think we can do it because not only does the network produce enough yield on its own to be able to supply even like a 10% fixed rate or something like this, we think we can do it in a way where we take the savings people and we pin them against the lending people.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the interest that they make, that the savings people make, it comes from the interest that is produced, like the income that's produced from lending out the asset. It's
Mm-hmm.
somewhat similar how a bank functions to some degree without the quantitative easing bullshit.
Of course.
So by pinning these two against each other, you actually create stability, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have a protocol and liquidity idea that's something similar to Ohm in the sense that will be a stabilizing factor on top of that, just to add more stability in that scenario. But we can pin these things in a way that we can produce fixed rate income, which I think would be a game changer in the space significantly.
Yeah, that's for sure. What other things are planned on being part of this whole Thor-Fi element?
So Thor savings is the first one. Lending is the second one. Um, we haven't like publicly discussed quite the design yet. We're still kind of thinking on it, and we're going to be
Mm-hmm.
surfacing it with the community in the next, hopefully week or two or so. Right now, it's being floated with big investors like Delphi, Multicoin, and this stuff to get their feedback to make sure we're not, missing anything or didn't think of X, Y, or Z or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. Because the implementation of this lending protocol is very different from everything else we've seen in the space, and it does things that nobody does or thought was even possible. For example, one of the things we're thinking about is that the collateralization is not going to be like 150% or 200% like you see on like MakerDAO or something like this. It would be 100% the swap value of the asset that your collateral is, right? And people think that's not possible because of X, Y, and blah, blah, blah. But in our case, the way that it's designed, it actually is feasible. We can get to that probably another time, another review, once we float the actual document out to the community so they can see it first before I talk about too much detail here. But there's a lot of things about that about that design. It's very different. Even no liquidations is actually one of the things that is being discussed. So you can't get liquidated. Is another kind of concept that people think is not possible, but it is. I think it is, at least.
How might something like that be possible?
I'm kind of hesitant to go into quite the details at this time, just because I want the community to see the full document in its full context.
Yeah.
But the short of it is that if the collateral is yield bearing, like LP units, right, that it always will, on the long term, it'll always become solvent because it's always generating yield, and the yield that it's generating is increasing over time because it's getting yield on the yield, right, on the compounding in that sense. And so the network can take that stance of being like a long-term investor because it's the network, right? You can look at a 100-year, timeline if it really wants to. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't have to in this case, But even if an asset performs extremely well over a long period, like the network should be able to handle it, no problem. So people can look at the details of how that implemented and the doc that's going to be released in the next week or two. But it's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So I guess under something like that, you wouldn't let someone who's insolvent then get their collateral back then, right? You'd have to hold on to it until it was either solvent, or they'd have to deposit some more in there to make sure everything worked.
Yeah. So what they would do in that case is if they wanted to get their collateral back, they had to give back the asset that they were lent out, right? If they wanted to like close it down early. But the network, because it has its yield bearing collateral, over a long period of time, it'll pay off your loan for you, very similar to like what Alchemix is doing, right? And so you don't even in most cases, you won't even need to pay back the original loan that you took out, right? You just won't have access to your collateral. And then once the loan is paid back with all the interest that's made from that collateral, you'll get your collateral back, right? And then you can sell it, or you can take out another loan, or like whatever you want to do with it.
Yeah, that's some pretty interesting stuff. Obviously, it's cutting edge as far as the crypto space is concerned, but the entire lending sector of crypto is very different from the lending sector of the fiat world, which it's funny because in the fiat world, you get loans based on, I guess, credit rating. Based on a lot of times it's like nothing, kind of like your personhood as a human being, and they're willing to take a gamble based on it because, the government has ways of cracking down on you if you, do some things. I'm sure there's a lot of risk calculated and things like that. And if you don't, there are no people on the blockchain, right? It's just, balances and stuff like that. And so that's why collateralized loans, take place. But then I'm thinking like, okay, well, what if I wanted to buy a house and I want to take out a loan? Do I have enough? I basically would have to have like enough money today to like buy the house free and clear, but I'm not just selling all my crypto for that. I have to do that. And then there's the sort of panic attack every time like the price of like the underlying network, like say Ethereum, dips too low, and I'm like, oh no, I'm about to get liquidated. But that kind of, it's kind of like bringing it back into a more, I guess, modern context, even though it still doesn't work on the same, I guess I would say, old and failed system of like the fiat lending world.
Yeah, so like one of the problems with the lending space, the lending space in the fiat world is like very different because you have like credit scores, and like you can go ahead and declare bankruptcy, and like that's kind of fine in a sense, right? And there's like a mathematical probability of what percentage of loans will they'll never get back because of bankruptcy, and what they won't, and so they just take on that risk, right? And they can do that because they're an individual entity that exists in all this kind of stuff. But the problem I see with lending today in the crypto space is that I find it to be very stressful. Yeah. Anybody who's like taking a loan is very stressed out because like one, you have to be like constantly looking at the price of like, let's just say taking Ethereum, for example. and making sure the Ethereum prices, your collateral price doesn't go down too low, you always get liquidated, because then you just lose a bunch of money, right? And you don't want that. And so you have to kind of keep your kind of finger on that pulse and make sure you don't get kind of screwed in the end, right? And in the other sense, like you have this like variable rate interest on your loan, right? And so it can just go ahead and skyrocket up to 40% one day. And you're like, oh shit, I'm getting I'm getting really hit hard here by this interest rate that just kind of skyrocketed because of something happened in the crypto space or like whatever happened. And so like I find that stuff to be very, very stressful, right? I don't really do a whole lot of lending myself personally, just because I don't want to have a part-time job of like checking the prices and checking my status and like making sure I don't get hit too hard. But in our perspective, and what we're trying to do with lending on THORChain is not only making it cross-chain so you can like actually get Bitcoin loans for the first time in human history, which that's by itself is pretty amazing, but also make it so that if you do take out a loan, you're not going to be stressed as fuck trying to like make sure you don't get liquidated or get interest rates get too high. We're aiming for us to be fixed rate interest on the savings as well as fixed rate interest on the lending part as well. And so by removing those kind of fluctuating and critical aspects of the current system, we feel that we've designed something that is fundamentally better and easier and less stress and less risk than what you would see in a MakerDAO or something else out there.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see how the world would kind of work on this, because I haven't been using a bank account in the last 5-6 years or whatever it's been. I've just been doing the crypto world, and there's certain benefits and reliefs and certain limitations of that, and I'm always kind of trying to see how the way I'm living is going to grow to be the way everyone's living, and just kind of some interesting kind of things on that front. So we're talking about how other lending systems in crypto might have a little bit more stress in them, and then also, as far as earlier, we were talking about how in order to participate in DeFi, you needed to completely do like non-native kind of bridged wrap things and all the complexity and risk that's involved with that. And basically, do you see long-term THORChain eating up, or the Thor and its children, one could say, eating up a lot of present DeFi's lunch because of just the who's going to be lending on the old Ethereum models, I guess, today, if they could do Thor-Fi and not have those risks and stresses, and who's going to be swapping a million different little wrapped this, wrapped that, if they can just do it natively on THORChain?
That's a complicated question in some sense. Everybody's different. Everybody's looking for different attributes and what they're trying to accomplish, what their risk factors are, what they're willing to take, what they're trying, and so that creates a different perspective or mindset that you're looking for different attributes, and maybe those are aligned with THORChain's offerings, and maybe it's not. It depends upon who you are, what maybe you're an ETH max ETH, you just love it. If anything that's not on ETH, you're just like doesn't exist, right? And so you just kind of ignore it completely. That's very well possible, but there are some cases where I think it doesn't make sense to use THORChain. And for example, the gas for Ethereum is more expensive on Ethereum than it would be for like a Uniswap or a Sushi, right? And the reason why that is because it takes 2 transactions, and the network has to charge for those 2 transactions. So it's always going to be more expensive in terms of gas fees. Fees might be smaller in general on THORChain with a sufficiently deep enough pool, but in that sense, you might say, "Oh, I'm not going to use THORChain. I'm going to use Uni to swap my Ethereum for Tether or whatever." Lending is a bit different. I think lending requires time and to prove its legitimacy, prove its stability, prove its it's earned its stripes in a sense. So it won't be something quick. But I do think over the long term, if we did end up just kind of deploying this lending protocol as we kind of see it now, there is not a strong argument why you'd want to use a different platform than THORChain, because it'll allow you to have access to more of your funds, have less risk and liquidations and all this kind of stuff. So it becomes a little bit kind of obvious.
Yeah.
to why you want to use it. And if it's not obvious to you, then Lord help you. I don't know what to tell you. but for most people, it'll be pretty obvious, and it just will take time for people to like wrap their heads around the concept and how it functions, and let it kind of have 6 months of kind of proving ground to prove that it does what it accomplishes, and that the design is solid. Same thing with like UST. If you think about UST from Terra, like it's a really popular, well-designed stablecoin, but like we don't know over the long term how it's going to succeed, right? I'm bullish on UST personally. I think it's a great design and all these things, but we have to see it go through a bear market, a bull market, and everything in between to know that its algorithmic approach to its pin to the dollar is going to be is going to work. And the only way you're going to know that, you can talk all day and draw on the whiteboard and come up with all these different kind of like reports saying that it'll always be stable. But the only way to really know is just to kind of try it, put it on the world, and see if it succeeds or not. I think it will, but it's going to take probably, in my opinion, 5 years for it to prove itself to be reliable in terms of being a stable asset. And so I think lending on THORChain's case will be something somewhat similar, and that it's going to take time to prove that its design isn't fundamentally flawed in some fashion or form.
Yeah, that's for sure. Now, a couple last things. First, scaling and privacy. So first, for scaling, what's the word of the day with DeFi? Because pretty much, I wouldn't say everything, but the vast majority of non-Ethereum DeFi's success is based on Ethereum's inability to scale to meet market demand at the present time. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of other DeFi things for other purposes out there. There will always be a proliferation thereof, but it seems like Ethereum hasn't scaled terribly well. Just the fact that I can't move most of my stuff. Maybe I'm a little salty personally, but whatever. It's so. What can you see as scaling? Do you see scaling as being a problem or an issue to solve in the future of THORChain?
Okay, well, so the problem of scalability is never solved. Like it's always a can that you kick down the road. Like will never be a moment in time when like we've solved scalability. Like that's never the case. I don't care how many transactions per second you say your network can sustain. I don't care what you say. It's always it's just a fundamental thing of like, think of it like a swimming pool. You can choose to build your swimming pool as large as you like, but at some point it has a limitation of how much water it can hold, right? Whether you do a small pool or like an Olympic sized swimming pool or whatever, it doesn't matter. There's always limitations. So will THORChain have scalability issues? Absolutely, right? Once it gets to a certain level of success, it will start to have scalability issues, and then you have to figure out how do we solve that. Now, you can do it in two different ways, ways to think about it. You can scale the layer one by optimizing things, maybe sharding things like Ethereum is doing in this Ethereum 2.0 design. Or you can think about it in the context of putting a layer two, right, on something on top of THORChain, which is also might be possible. I haven't actually given layer two much of a thought, to be honest with you, just because it's like years down the road. It doesn't really warrant my time to think too much about it. But those are two ways you can think about it. And so THORChain will definitely have scalability issues. Ethereum will partially solve their scalability issues with sharding to some degree. It won't, like I said, it won't solve scalability. It'll just improve the situation. And then layer two of Ethereum, whether it be optimism or rollups or whatever it is you're talking about, will help with the scalability issue. But again, it will never actually solve scalability entirely. So it only takes more pressure and more time and more adoption of the space of more of like normies or pre-coiners to come into the space and say, I'm going to start swapping, trading, providing liquidity, lending, whatever the thing is. And it will always cause scalability issues over the long term.
Yeah. And so basically it will always be an issue, but you guys are kind of focused on making sure it's not an issue to the best of your ability. That's kind of what TLDR.
In terms of like THORChain's perspective, like you could literally fill the entire block of Ethereum plus Bitcoin plus Litecoin plus Bitcoin Cash plus like a bunch more chains, like literally fill the entire block with like swaps, and like THORChain can like support that. Like it
Mm-hmm.
wouldn't struggle too much with that. And I mean, even right now, it has a limitation of I think it's like 100 swaps per block every 5 seconds, and that's an
Mm-hmm.
artificial limit put on top of it for design purposes. There's no reason why you couldn't just increase it to 200 if you wanted to. Like that would be fine too, right? So
Mm-hmm.
like I don't think we're going to hit scalability issues anytime in the near future. In part because THORChain will probably never really be a like general purpose smart contracting layer like Ethereum is, or
Mm-hmm.
like Avalanche is, or like Terra is. Its design is not trying to replicate what I see as the mistake of Ethereum of trying to be the one all be all, like this is the end of crypt, like other chains thing that will solve all problems.
Mm-hmm.
No, that won't work for any technology ever in the history of the world. So it won't work here either. And so the block space of THORChain will always be fixated on doing what it does best, which is anything around its liquidity pools. It's not trying to do derivative trading or like options or like derivative other forms of like crazy trading. There are other people who can do that space, and what they can do is they can just borrow from THORChain's synthetics, and beam a synthetic Bitcoin
Mm-hmm.
via IBC from THORChain over to Injective, for example, and do derivatives trading over there, right? And that's the way that you scale like DeFi in general. Is you have each application be its own like chain, and that way it can scale much better, much faster, rather than having all the applications of the world be on one layer one, which is what Ethereum's trying to do, which is
Mm-hmm.
why Ethereum is like so absurdly expensive now to do transactions and all this kind of stuff, which is highly problematic. And like I mind you that like crypto in general, Ethereum is like not adopted yet. Like it's still a
Yeah.
minority thing. Like the world hasn't like got onto Ethereum yet, and it's already a big issue, right? And
Yeah.
I know an ETH person here would argue with me about layer two and like ETH 2.0 and like all these things, and those are valid arguments to be had. But
Mm-hmm.
even with those things, like it's still not ready, right? Neither is like Solana or Terra or Avalanche or any of these other guys. Like any of these guys would collapse under like if the world actually adopted crypto at this
Mm-hmm.
time, right? When the infrastructure of crypto is not ready for the world yet. Everyone's always talking about how to make crypto more easy to use so get more people
Mass
into it. It's like,
adoption.
yeah, but like we're not even
Mm-hmm.
ready for them yet. we
Yeah,
have
of course.
technologically we're just not ready for the world to adopt even Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of these things. It's just like we need to work on scalability, and before we get to the usability of like how do I secure
Mm-hmm.
my wallet and make it easy to use and all these things, we're not even there yet. You're 8 steps ahead. We have to solve more immediate issues.
Yeah. And so then the final thing then is privacy, which it's something that it's kind of funny because, you know, I'm old enough in the space that I remember when you just had one Bitcoin address. It was just a static address. That's all you did. And I remember being a confused, angry boomer when we had HD wallets. And why do I have a new address every time? I don't get this stuff. And so there was all that stuff. And then, of course, using CoinJoin and things like that, using more encrypted things. It seems like in the ETH and DeFi sort of world, almost that privacy is taken a step backwards beyond that. So like most of these ETH type chains have, you know, a static address. They don't do UTXOs. And when it's just sending back and forth between like, oh, I sent you money, how much you have in this wallet, like that's enough of a problem. But then when you start seeing like when you have financial systems, not just sending some money here and there, when you have financial systems run on this stuff and it's all super transparent, I would say, right? So like if I want to, you know, LP for THORChain, I send to to a certain address. It goes into a pool and stuff, and then it's should be relatively trivial for someone who's, I guess, malicious, wants to just see how much I have, and then, you know, find if I'm worth doxing my address and attacking my house or whatever over. It seems like it's relatively easy to figure all that stuff out. So
Yeah.
is there anything that can really be done about this in the short term, or do you have any thoughts about how to make people's finances more confidential in the world where THORChain represents more of real people's actual financial activity?
Yeah. So we thought a lot about privacy in the beginning, and we opted to not include privacy into the core protocol for a good reason. Because in the end, the network has to sign transactions, has to know what transactions to sign outward. Like you send in some Bitcoin, you're trying to get some Ethereum. At some level, somebody's got to sign a transaction that sends Ethereum to some address, right? And because of that, you could encrypt that information in a way that only the like validators of the network would know the information. It wouldn't be public. It would be like just this, validator set would actually have the understanding of what was what and when and where. But the problem with that is that as soon as you do that, you created an incentive to run a validator node outside the context of the economic purpose of why you actually want to be a validator node, right? My video paused. I'm not sure if I still have you.
Yeah, I can still hear the audio. Just go ahead. You're good now.
Okay, sorry. So that would incentivize somebody like the IRS or the NSA or some three-letter alphabet agency, foreign and domestic, to run a node because it allows them to be able to gather information and spy on people in a way that is against the actual economic imperatives of the network. So we actually work against the network's best interest to do privacy in this particular case. So instead of actually doing privacy on the core protocol of THORChain, our kind of thinking was that we will integrate with privacy chains and have them be the way. So you pull on the power of privacy, whether it be Monero or Zcash or what have you, and utilizing their implementation of privacy to give you privacy if you choose to have it.
Yeah, so basically what you do is you have to make sure all your, T's are crossed and your I's are dotted on your personal transaction level so that by the time you go to make a swap, for example, everything is already churned, encrypted, whatever the deal is, so that if people see, oh, this much was made for this much of a swap, the amount of data it's not really super useful to anyone trying to track you because you've already made yourself very hard to track. And so this extra data doesn't really correlate to you and your stash as a person as long as you practice good, privacy on the way in and then on the way out.
Yeah. So one way you could approach this is you have like a private Bitcoin wallet and a public Bitcoin wallet, right? And so if you want to move funds into your private Bitcoin wallet, you can swap your Bitcoin to, like, let's just say Zcash, for example. And now you hold it in some sort of Zcash wallet address. And then you swap it from Zcash into your private Bitcoin wallet. And so that little kind of hop, you won't be able to understand from the outside that those two things are correlated or connected in any sense, especially if you swap in a smart way. And so then when you want to move funds out, you just kind of do the reverse, swap into your Zcash or the Monero address, and then swap to your public Bitcoin address. So you're only exposed to, the Monero or whatever for a relatively short period of time. And then you move to Bitcoin and then you give your friend some sats for buying dinner the other night or something like this.
Yeah. And so basically that's kind of achievable through that. It's kind of funny because on the other side of things, which works very different from THORChain in quite many ways, Incognito is trying to do a similar thing, except the other way around, where you don't have any privacy going in, but once you're in, you do kind of have privacy in the swaps back and forth or whatever. But it's a completely different system. But I'm sure you mentioned
the secret network is also doing something similar to that too. If you look into the secret network and other Cosmos, they do kind of like encrypted smart contracts, I think.
Yeah, and so basically, maybe that would be a second part of the answer is it's not just take care of your privacy on the way in and out and don't worry so much about the THORChain part of things, but also there's other projects that are more specifically tailor-made towards having privacy at that core swapping kind of level.
Yeah, another way to think about it is that, like, THORChain's not trying to solve every problem or do everything perfectly. That's just a little bit too crazy in a sense. So instead, like, it's basically enabling you access to the powerful aspects of whatever chain it is you want to talk about, whether it be the store of value of Bitcoin, the privacy of Monero, the smart contracting of Ethereum, the stable coins of Terra, like, or whatever it is you want to have access to. Like, we kind of let everybody else do what they do, and we focus on what we do, and we focus and do that thing well, and they do their thing well, rather than us trying to like, okay, we're gonna do privacy, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this, like, and smart contracting and like all these things, and it just becomes such a crazy snowball that can fall apart in any given second, in a sense, trying to solve every problem in the world. And so we recognize that we see a multi-chain future, and we see the value that each chain individually proposes, and we want to just enable you to have access to the value of whatever chain it is that you want to access to. So we don't think about privacy too much in terms of the core protocol. You want privacy, use something that is specifically designed for that and does a lot better job of it than we probably could.
Yeah, that kind of brings back the popular crypto meme of the intelligence bell curve. At the beginning, it's like coin does one thing. In the middle, no, you have to do everything under the sun. And then on the intelligent level, back to coin does one thing. Not necessarily one thing, but it focuses on what it's good for, and then other chains focus on what they're good for. And I guess that in and of itself strengthens the value proposition of THORChain, because when you want a different project to do a different thing really well, it's easy to hop between one and the other.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like I don't know if this is too obscure of a reference, but like in Linux, I don't know if your users are familiar with Linux, but like the mentality in like programming within the Linux system, it's like you do one thing and you do it very, very well. Like every command line to a Linux pretty much does a single thing, and does that single thing very, very well, right? Even something is like, I want to read a file, I want to write to a file, I want to, get the last 10 lines of a file. Like all those things are like separate, like commands or separate programs. And so you just basically you like daisy chain together, or we call piping in the Linux world, but like you daisy chain together like 5 or 10 commands that do something, and parsing information and awking this and then setting that and then TRing that, and then like all these kind of funny little commands that exist. And so there is no one command that does everything in Linux, and there never will be, and there shouldn't be. And you want to focus on everything does very narrow perspective of what it accomplishes, and that way you can just daisy chain the things together. Or interoperability is kind of like the word that people use in the crypto space to make all these things connect and be of higher value.
Yeah, interoperability is the word of the day. Well, this has been quite the illuminating chat. Where could people find more about what you're up to, and then what is THORChain up to?
Yeah, so THORChain, you can follow the project at thorchain.org if you want to go to the website. There's a Discord that's very healthy and people chatting all the time. You can ask questions and kind of participate in the conversations. I'm on Twitter, but I always say don't follow me. I'm useless. I'm meaningless. Always follow the community. They're much more useful than I am. But start with thorchain.org. There's docs.thorchain.org if you want to learn about the economics, the technology, the cryptography, all that stuff that's been innovated as part of this project. All that stuff is available through those docs. And come in the Discord, ask some questions.
All right. Well, fantastic. Well, thanks very much for being on. And I'll see everyone next time.